we're making a continuous ventilation path from the soffit to the ridge underneath the low E coating of the Galvalume roof. So we end up with a breathable roof system that's got a good ventilated radiant barrier.
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Pro Talk podcast, a regular discussion with industry professionals. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. I am joined today by architect Peter Pfeiffer of Austin, Texas. Peter, it's a pleasure to have you on this show. Thank you so much for doing this.
I'm looking forward to it, Patrick.
You are probably one of the most famous architects in the country, I would say. What made you want to become an architect?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I agree with the most famous architects in the country, one of them, but still, it doesn't matter.
In my circles, Peter, you're a legend, and I am grateful that you're on the show.
Well, thank you. Like a lot of my colleagues in architecture, it was probably pretty early in life. I was maybe 12 or 13 years old. And I have to credit my mother with this. She noticed that I really liked building because I was involved with my father and this carpenter and my brothers doing remodeling projects in our house since I was like 5. But I really had an artistic tendency, and I was very comfortable with math. So I just started doing things like riding my bicycle to the Washington Bridge. I grew up northeast of Dallas in this area called New Jersey. And that's a joke, you see. And I would ride my bike out from New Jersey out to the Washington Bridge just to look at the buildings from the bridge. And, you just start realizing this is something that really kind of excites you. And I just made I think the other thing that happened was President Carter speaking about the Arab oil embargo and how we had to save energy or conserve energy. And that really spoke to me too, which is why my first degree I pursued was in building sciences, specifically towards energy efficient architecture, or what we called passive solar architecture back then. It was in the architecture school. I was on track to get an architecture degree, but I found the studying of the science of building probably a little bit more interesting than the design studios. So
I think that would put you in pretty rarefied air amongst designers. What made you interested in that? Was it the shortage of fuel in our country at that time?
I was lucky. The shortage of fuel, it started a whole movement that unfortunately has kind of faded away. But then I was lucky enough to get an internship with Paolo Soleri, the well-known Italian architect out in Arizona, building Arco Santi, which is an arcology by the Cosanti Foundation. Arcologies were the blending of architecture and ecology. So he was marvelously not only helpful, but enthusiastic about passive solar cooling techniques. Coming from upstate New York, where I went to Rensselaer, my university, we were all talked about energy conservation in the winter. What he opened my eyes to was energy conservation for hot southern living. So it was all these various people who were giving me direction and enthusiasm that made me eventually go back. When I got out of college, I ended up in Houston and worked for an architectural firm, but then spent the next 3.5 years working for a commercial construction company. I loved it. But Patrick, this is where I came to a conclusion. I love the science of building, and I love the building, but I didn't love it as much as architectural design, the approach from the architect's perspective instead of the builder's perspective. So I looked at MIT and Berkeley, which were well known at the time for graduate schools in architecture, but I discovered a professor at the University of Texas who is just exploring for the first time how to model houses and buildings on a computer to analyze its energy consumption. This was 1979. And that was a big deal. I mean, we all take it for granted now, but there were no energy analysis programs that were publicly available till probably 15 years later. So we got to work on developing some of the first ones in the country. And then that led to the development of Energy Star, if you're familiar with that.
Sure. So how did you end up in Texas? You said you took an internship in Houston. Is that why you ended up there?
No. I was really on my way out to San Diego to go to work for one of the guys who I got to know in the internship I did in Arizona 2 years beforehand. But when I got to Houston, I saw how many buildings were being erected, which is just wonderful compared to how dull the Northeast was at the time, where no one was doing anything. We were in the grips of a recession up east, but a building boom down south. So my cousin, who I was staying with, said, "Why don't you just interview?" And I did, and I got a few great job offers. And I figured, okay, I'll stay here a year, then go back to Rensselaer or graduate school for my finish up my architecture degree. And that was 40 years ago at this point. No,
So
that was
how does
43
a
years ago.
guy from New Jersey and then upstate New York adapt to the climate in Texas, Houston especially?
Well, thankfully, I love swimming, and I got to. I'd only stay at places where there are swimming pools. But it's an interesting story because when I did get into being a builder in Houston and having to just check building code things, I was a project engineer on a high rise being built and then another one. And then after architecture school, working for an architect, I got into the codes and realized the codes are very, very biased at the time to the north. And many of them, in fact, I understand, maybe differently, were based on the New York building code. So all sorts of things like attic ventilation, crawl space ventilation, ceiling attics, radiation barriers, they either weren't addressed or they were all addressed wrongly.
So how did you get it right? Did you have to develop the standards yourself for the buildings you were designing?
Yes, but let me tell you the motivation. In the first year of grad school, that professor, who was a physicist on the University of Texas's architecture school staff, was my mentor. And the first day of classes, he said, "Look, it's really pretty simple. We're going to do all this energy analysis to show you what makes sense or determine what makes sense to do. But it really comes down to this one very basic thing. You do to your building what you would do to yourself to make you comfortable in that setting." He said, for example, how many days a year here in Austin, Texas, or how many days a year up where you're from? And he pointed to me up in Troy, New York, would a heavy overcoat make you feel comfortable? And I said, not only comfortable, they're critical, probably 40, 50, 75 days a year. He goes, good. How many days a year would that make you feel comfortable here? And we all looked and laughed. And I don't know, one or two. I mean, we rarely get below freezing here. On the other end, he said, how many days will it make you feel more comfortable during the year to get out of the sunshine and stand in the shade? And we all said, probably about 358 days a year. He said, good. So that's why you have to look at heat transfer in the three ways: conduction, convection, well, actually in the order of strength, radiation, then conduction, then convection. So let's deal with the problem that's appropriate for us here, which is the transfer of heat from the sun, radiation. Next, we'll look at how important conduction is. And thirdly, we'll look at how important or not important dealing with convection heat flow is. And that was really what got my mind going. And that's when we started experimenting with modeling buildings with just radiation barriers in the attic and it was pretty good. You'd cut the temperatures down by between 20 and 25 degrees in the attic, and therefore the insulation on the attic floor had less work to do to protect the living space from the hot attic. But then we also started questioning, why are we ventilating an attic? Did you guys ever figure out why the codes ask you to ventilate an attic?
It was some early research that indicated it would prevent peeling paint, as I recall. And it's pretty half-baked research, right? The conclusion did not follow the research, and it was half-baked at best, from my understanding.
Well, here's my understanding, which isn't too far different, but that it came about after World War II, and specifically associated with Levittown being built out in Long Island, where they were using two very unique things that hadn't been used before the war: plywood roof sheathing and composition shingles for the roofing. And what they found is, because that roof system wasn't naturally breathing the way a cedar shake roof would breathe, that moisture in the wintertime would accumulate up in the attic from cooking and bathing and whatnot, and produce condensation on the underside of the structural members and start leading to premature rot. So they want to vent that humidity out of the attic. And it's important because you come to Texas and you're talking with your colleagues in architecture and building, and they think you're venting the attic to cool it. And that's when I came up with the analogy of a showed him, I said, look, let's put a bowl of chili in the microwave oven. Now, this is a rough analogy, but it still makes the point. We can heat up that chili using a form of radiant heat transfer in about 2 minutes. That same bowl of chili in the oven where it's using radiation and convection might take 15 or 20 minutes to heat up. Or another visual is, if you put that bowl of chili that was in the microwave oven, if you left it there and turned on and kept the microwave on, but could somehow blow on the chili, would you accomplish anything? We're just making the point that ventilating an attic where the heat was coming from solar radiation was what we used to say, pissing in the wind.
Right. So that's a perfect segue. So to deal with your climate, I know you happen to be a proponent of two things. One is radiant barriers that you just mentioned, and let's touch on that a little later. But the other thing is you have vented roof assemblies, not vented attics. You actually try to employ metal roofs that, as I understand it, have battens underneath it that allow airflow to cool the attic. And you have to explain to me what the heck this is supposed to do, because I don't really get it.
Okay. We have to stay on the radiant barrier thing for just a minute.
Okay.
Because it's one leads to the other, leads to the other. Radiant barriers, we determined, okay, they are good. And we noticed that when we started building houses, I had a design build company, we would drape the foil between the rafters, 4-foot wide foil rolls. It was really awkward. And get this airflow underneath the roof decking and underneath the radiant barrier. And those houses were significantly cooler. All the workers would come over in the subdivision and eat in our house because it was cooler than the homes they were building without any kind of radiation barrier. Then we came up with the idea of stapling the radiation barrier to the plywood to make it easier for the guys out in the field, not having to balance on rafters with this roll of foil.
So you'd physically put it on the sheets of plywood before it was nailed to the
with the
trusses or rafters. Uh-huh.
And we bought some industrial grade foil and did it. I gave a talk about that. This is like in 1988, 89, to some of my builder colleagues at a Texas Society of Architects and Builders Convention. And one of the guys came up to me later and said, we could go into business together and manufacture that. And that's how we started what became known as Cool Ply, where we actually glued the foil. We dripped the glue onto these sheets of plywood as they ran on a conveyor belt, and then put the foil down on it. It was very rudimentary. You
were out there with a squeegee or a roller and put it on there?
and his high school sons and some of my friends. And that's how we built our first batch. And then to Robert, his name was Robert Hagerman. To his credit, he ran all over the South marketing this stuff. And at one point, then we established a licensing agreement where he'd pay me a certain amount of money for every board he sold. Long story short, we eventually, because I wanted to be an architect and he wanted to do other things, sold it to Louisiana Pacific Lumber Company. And that's where TechShield came from.
And is that product really mainstream where you are? Because it's odd up here, frankly.
Well, sure, it is odd. It is mainstream here. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why I was inducted into the College of Fellows in America was it was estimated at the time, and I became a fellow almost 18 years ago, that there were probably over 750,000 homes in America built with radiant barriers because of this. And it's effective where you use air conditioning a lot. Like if you're doing a seashore house in Stone Harbor, New Jersey, we are, and the first one I did, which you guys wrote about, and it's used primarily in the summer. Well, back in the 80s, we didn't care. No one had air conditioning, but people do air condition homes now, and they do care about excess heat gain. So it would make sense in a summertime use place, but it really makes sense anywhere where you're air conditioning more than just a few months of the year, the way you are in the South.
I'm paraphrasing some research that the Florida Solar Institute did, but the upshot of it was that if you took the money you would ordinarily spend on a radiant barrier and put it into insulating the attic space with the additional money, that you will have
a better return,
better result than if you put the radiant barrier in. Do you take exception to that?
It's hard to paint things in such a black and white way. We got the manufacturing and the cost associated with Cool Ply was like $450 for a 2,500
It's
square foot.
nothing, right?
It was nothing. And there was no extra labor. We just had to convince the contractors to put the shiny side down. And you laugh, but there was an awful lot of people who didn't understand that.
I'm going to ask you a question related to that later, so I
We'll get to
totally
that.
get it.
But I find it's particularly good. Well, I don't use it that much anymore. This is the beginning of the morphing story. But still, I do use it in things like workshops and garages that we're not heating and cooling. But we do want to have some good protection and not hold the heat in. So my own workshop has got a radiant barrier in the roof system, and I believe it helps. I think, look, the way I understood it, and we did model it, a radiant barrier in our climate in the summer was the equivalent, and this is a rough equivalency because you're comparing radiation transfer and conductive transfer. It's the equivalent to R19 insulation. So if you're doing a roof system, for example, where you don't want to have a really thick roof system filled up with 9, 10, 11 inches of insulation, you could do a 2x6 rafter thing and make that as your vaulted ceiling and put a radiant barrier system on top of that and have a really good performing roof.
I asked a dumb question on the podcast, which led to Kylie's idea to have you on Pro Talk, but I can't figure out how the product works when it's glued to the underside of sheathing, because intuitively, that's the reflective side. And it leads me to what your builders were trying to do, which was to put it upside down, because they, like me, think that the shiny side is what's doing the work, but it's not.
There's a good story about these reflective roof coatings at Oak Ridge Labs, where I was doing a study on, this is, I think, in the late 90s, early 2000s, where they were looking at how effective light-colored roof coatings are, or semi-reflective roof coatings are. But when I was meeting with them, I said, well, how long will it last? And they came back and said, well, probably 5 years, maybe as much as 10 years, depending on how much mold and mildew and sediment or soot there is.
So the point you're making is that its effectiveness is reduced when it gets dirty, or
right.
Yeah.
And then there's this other thing about physics. It's the same thing, Patrick, or a similar thing as low E glass. How does low E glass work in the South? Well, they have a radiant barrier, essentially a low emissivity coating on the inside facing surface of the outer pane of glass. So when the sun hits the outer pane of glass from the outside and heats up that glass, among other things, very little of that heat transfers across that little airspace to the inside pane of glass. And that's what we're looking at here. We're actually producing a low emissivity coating on the underside of the roof so that the plywood will get hot, the shingles will get hot, maybe 4 to 10 degrees warmer. But so long as you minimize what's touching the underside of this low E coating or this low E surface, if you touch it, if you went up the attic of this old house where on a summer day, it's hot. It's 120, 130 degrees. You hold your hand 2 inches away and you barely feel the heat because it's emitting so little of its heat that it absorbed.
Where's it going then? Is it reflecting the other way?
One could say reflecting, although that's not probably the best way of it. It is being rushed out by convection because we set up these convection paths. And yeah, it does basically get reabsorbed into the roof sheathing and the roof decking above it, the decking and the shingles and all that.
Fascinating.
It makes an awful lot of people scratch their head.
I don't profess to be too smart, but it's baffling to me. But it's not visible light. That's the thing I think you have to get.
When you were growing up, probably remember. Well, I don't know how old you are, but the lunar excursion module, those spaceships that they landed on the moon with. Why do you think they're all wrapped in foil? You've seen them, right?
Sure. Because it's solar radiation, right? It's trying to keep it off the materials.
Well, also to minimize the transmission of the heat from inside the capsule to the wicked coldness of outer space. And they didn't have the room to do really thick insulation. So they did, among other things, they employed radiant barriers that kept the heat in this particular case.
Can you talk about the other prong to your two-pronged approach to keep houses cooler?
Yeah, well, what happened was when I went to build my own home, which was in time frame of 2000, 2001.
The greenest
I
home in America.
No, you guys did that moniker. I did not, and I got so much crap for that from my colleagues, as you can imagine. I was embarrassed. Anyway, I came to think of the metal roofing, Galvalume roofing, as having a radiant barrier built into it. This came from another dinner discussion with an author of an article that was written by the Florida Solar Energy Center that said that basically light colored sheet metal doesn't do all that much to thwart the flow of heat from the sun. And I thought, well, that doesn't sound quite right. I called him up and said, what roofing panel did you use? And he said, we just went to the hardware store and got light sheet metal. Then we tested its reflectivity and its emissivity, and that's how we got our result. Well, I don't think that's right for Galvalume. They didn't even know the difference between Galvalume and galvanized. Galvalume metal is molten aluminum and zinc splattered on sheet metal. Galvanized is just all molten zinc. So Galvalume gives you that aluminized coating. So I sent roof samples to the exact same lab and asked for the same technician in Phoenix, Arizona, to do the test that did the test for this author of this article at Florida Solar Energy Center. And he came back with tremendously different results. We paid for the lab testing. It wasn't that expensive. But the long and the short of it is the underside of a Galvalume roof is a pretty decent radiation barrier or low E coating. It thwarts about 72% of the heat hitting the outer surface. And so that's what led to the idea of, well, why don't we just raise the metal roof off this roof subdecking, get airflow underneath it so that we could make the roof self-healing too. And I'll get to that in a minute. And then I was looking at the idea of doing cross battens where you put down the plywood and your 30-pound felt. Then you run some strips of 1x4s from the soffit up to the ridge to make for the air channels. And then you run the roofing support lathing pieces perpendicular to that from the left to the right to support the roof panels. So the one layer would produce the air channels, the other layer on top of it would support the roof. And that was going to be about $4,000 or $5,000. And I was sleeping one night and I came up with this idea of just putting them at an angle and doing them discontinuously so that you could support the roof and produce some forms of air channels all throughout. And we got better and better with this. Now we do 4-foot long sections with about 1.5 inch gap. Long and the short of it is we're making a continuous ventilation path from the soffit to the ridge underneath the low E coating of the Galvalume roof. So we end up with a breathable roof system that's got a good ventilated radiant barrier. And then we can do a sealed attic below and not be concerned about trapping moisture or premature rotting of the roof decking or any of that lovely stuff.
And I assume this is a priority in your climate because everyone's ductwork is in the attic, right? You don't generally find basements where people in the Northeast and the upper Midwest would run their mechanical systems, right?
That's right. First of all, basements aren't needed and they're expensive, so they're not done. That's it. It's a very expensive way of creating storage. People would rather build up into the attic if you wanted extra storage. But the other thing is floor registers aren't all that fun if you're air conditioning all the time because you might be sitting near it. And then I was in a restaurant. So it's really much more comfortable to distribute the air from up high. Then we used to always do the air conditioning ducts in fur downs. But the problem with that is if you wanted to use good metal ducting, then you had to really wrestle with the carpentry to get the sections of metal ducting in there. You'd almost have to have the duct guy over there at the same time they're framing.
Yeah.
That's why you still see so many ducts in the attic here. You can do a much better, more thorough, air-tested duct job, and you can kneel down right next to it. You're not trying to squeeze it up in between framing members and jockey it into position. Then you can't reach on the other side of the joint to get the mastic on. So that's why it's in attics. So you're not going to lose attics in the South as being a place for air conditioning equipment and ducts anytime soon. Furthermore, it's a much less expensive place to make bigger for storage. So the beauty of it all was, and this was the first house, as I know, I did it where I did three different attics. We did a traditional radiant barrier attic, ventilated radiant barrier roof system there. Here we did this system with just the without the radiant barrier, but with the Galvalume roof. And this system, I went away for a few weeks when summer was really hot here, and I kept these electronic logging thermometers in the attic. This attic would get up to 95 to 105 degrees. This attic never got warmer than about 88, 89 degrees, and the air conditioning was off in the house. We were in Europe for 2 weeks. So that's when I began to realize, wow, something is really working well here. My only regret, maybe, is that I wanted to test it before I went public with it. But because you guys and others did some articles on it where I was talking about what I'm experimenting with, I could not patent it, which was okay. I figured, let's just disseminate it out into the building industry and make for better built houses in America because of it.
So why do you think the codes have not, why are they so non-adaptable to the various regions in the country? I think you'd agree that different regions of the country have different building techniques for good reason. Why is the code so focused on heating climates?
This is going to sound cynical. I'm in my 60s now, Patrick, but I did participate in a lot of code writing committees and even went to the big code hearings in Orlando. The codes are just like what, unfortunately, and this may be sounding politically strange, but just like what happened with LEED, stakeholders take over science. I think you could make a good scientific case for not getting much benefit at all in the South for having 2x6 walls versus 2x4 walls stuffed with insulation. I mean, I can tell you, you run the energy runs, it's anywhere from a 5 to 8% bump in it if you double the insulation of your walls. It's not about conductive R value. It's about the fact that the Insulation Manufacturers Association is a very strong lobby. I watched it occur. Mm. And everybody, it's almost like one of these things that everybody just always knows. And so, yeah, insulation saves energy. Insulation saves energy. They did a great job in marketing around the time of the oil embargo in the 70s. The Pink Panther, remember that?
I remember that, Peter. I remember the Pink Panther rolling out insulation in your attic. And it was just like, oh, this is so easy. You don't need to do any air sealing. You just put this layer of stuff up there and your house is going to be warmer and more comfortable.
And what would he say always? Insulation saves energy. So it's ingrained.
It worries me that we're trusting a Pink Panther with our insulation strategies in this country, right?
Look, this is why I really got to not only like Rensselaer and its building science program. I don't think any other school in the country was doing a building science curriculum before then. But then meeting this professor, Paco Arumi was his name, and he passed away at only 64 years old a few years ago. But he was a genius in figuring out how to model and deal with radiation, the heat transfer of heat associated with radiation, because everything else is all talks about conduction and convection in energy runs. But he was playing with radiation.
Do you think that the building industry should be making an effort to have the standards more regional?
Yes, of course, but I don't. You got to look at the motivations of the suppliers. But yes, of course, I think it could be more regional. Look, the way I look at it is, I do believe in that trickle down effect. When we did our first house with a radiant barrier, it wasn't a starter home and it wasn't a home for a low income family. It was a home for a fairly well-to-do, accomplished IBM executive. And I explained to him my master's work in radiant barriers and stuff like that, or my master's project employing radiant barriers. And he said, well, let's try it. What is it? $400 or $500? What the hell? Let's try it. And then that caught on, and you almost have to look hard for a house in the South, or you had to up until spray foam became popular, for a house without a radiant barrier. It caught on like wildfire, as they say. I think what we're talking about with this raised metal roof or providing an airspace underneath a shingle roof, that's not going to catch on like wildfire. It's just going to be
because it's expensive, Peter.
It adds about it's just that that battening, the angled batten system or lathing system adds $3,000-4,000 to the cost of a house. One could argue that it's a pretty long payback. My argument is it makes the house more comfortable too.
Mhm.
Like in May, we don't have to turn on the air conditioner because we're getting so little heat flux through the roof, whereas another house would be turning on its air conditioner in May. So we have maybe 2 months less air conditioning time in the summer, plus less heat to have to fight. Uh, it just makes places more comfortable. But the other thing I like about raising the metal roof or creating some type of airspace associated with the sheathing is the fact that other things are coming to play here, Patrick. This idea of spraying the foam to the underside of the roof, especially if it's a closed cell foam, well, you just took away the ability for the hot attic to dry out wet sheathing,
Mhm.
wet roof decking. And things always fail, roofs always leak eventually. This idea of doing peel and seal on the roof decking, I'm not a real fan of because something always fails somewhere. And if it does and you get moisture in there, you've trapped it. You've sprayed the foam to the underside, you've put the peel and seal or some other non permeable membrane on the top side, and that decking is just going to turn into mush over time, especially with OSB being used so prevalently. Uh, so I like the idea of 30-pound felt over the decking. 2 layers we end up doing because we put on one layer to dry in the house, and a few weeks later when they're finally ready to put the roof on, we put on the second layer. Because if moisture gets into the roof system, let's say around some of these flashing these penetrations associated with the water venting, um, it can roll out and come out the soffit, or it can just dry out. It gets darnably hot underneath that metal, between that metal and the decking. So it's a self-healing roof system. You get that?
I'm going to change gears a little bit. What can builders do to make an architect's life easier?
I like it because I'm always hearing the opposite.
Well, I'm going to ask you that next. So there you go.
What can builders do to make, the simple answer to that one is follow the plans, follow the specs. And if you have a question, gosh darn it, everybody's got a cell phone now on the job site. Call up the architect who
Don't
specifies
plunge
this
ahead,
thing.
right?
Yeah, don't go ahead or don't go around the architect and tell the owner, well, the architect specified this, but I think it's all wrong. No, just keep a collaborative approach. Call us. I've had plumbers call me up about another detail we use where we do floor drains. Everywhere there's water in a house, there's a floor drain. Everywhere. Underneath the refrigerator, the washing machines, the dishwasher, everywhere. And they were saying, oh, it's a $5,000 to $10,000 ad. I said, no, it's just a 2-inch PVC pipe coming up. You cut it flush with the floor. You paint some rubber paint around it, or another group will, and you just you gang them and run it to the outside. It's just a fail-safe measure. It's maybe $500, not $5,000. But the point is, we couldn't have had that conversation if I didn't learn that the builder had told the homeowner, we got to get rid of this floor drain thing Pfeiffer came up with because it's adding $5,000 to the house. Proactively, I could have explained to him, you're reading too deeply into it. These don't need to be wet prime drains. So that's the point I'm trying to make, Patrick, is just communicate. Builders, communicate with your architects. Don't try to do stuff behind their back. It doesn't work.
What about how can architects make a builder's life easier?
Flip side of that, same thing. During design, look, I think it's critically important for the architect and the builder team to be assembled right when we start designing the project. And we stay as a team together to a substantial completion of the project. In the beginning part, the architect is the lead and the builder is a consultant. In the building part, it's flipped. But what I find that architects can do to help builders out is don't promote this goofy myth of, gee, if I get 3 bids, that's good. If I get 5 bids, that's even better. No, what we say is when we start up with a client, and I'm starting up with one later on this afternoon, their very first assignment is going to go out and visit with and interview these 3 different builders I've already vetted that we've worked with before and choose one. So that when we are doing the preliminary design, very quickly, immediately at the time we're doing the design, we have the builder kind of going back and forth with us about estimated cost. We do the design drawings and we get a preliminary cost estimate that we vet with them. Go back to that story of the plumber and the floor drains and the misinterpretation of how much it was going to cost. We have never found a builder's preliminary estimate with anything less than a half a dozen mistakes, or maybe one would call misinterpretations in it. There, the team is working together to present a vetted preliminary estimate to the client. Then you take that team and you do it further. You do the design development drawings, get the builder update his pricing, so that when you do the final estimate on the construction documents, the inevitable escalation in cost is nobody's surprise. The owner has been kept up to date on it. It's sort of the benefits of a design build company without the fierce liabilities. I had a design build company. You want your architect and your builder to be independent entities working for you. You don't want the architect working for the builder, because then if you're asking the architect to be checking on the builder's work, are you really being realistic? If the architect works for the builder, or even vice versa in some cases. No, just get a good architect, get a good builder, build the team, keep the team together.
How would you tell folks to find a good architect?
Well, that's a good question. It used to be that 80 to 90% of our work certainly in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s was through the traditional word of mouth and writing articles for magazines like yours and Journal of Light Construction, and then getting asked to speak on places. It was word of mouth. It's very different now. We were just doing an analysis in 2020. 94% of our jobs came from Google searching, people searching the internet using Google.
I think you'd agree, though, that just because you can be found on Google doesn't mean you know what you're doing.
Well, I agree. It's tough. The buyer has got to beware. And then the other sad thing is people are judging architects based on the pictures on their website instead of reading about their approach and their background. And I think that's sort of like judging a book by its cover in the bookstore when you're trying to figure out what you're going to read for the summer.
That's a good analogy.
But it is tough. Word of mouth. But we do. Look, if somebody is looking to do a green home, a particularly energy efficient and healthy home, our name will come up. And most of those people, when they've come to us, they've gone deeper than just a typical internet search or Google search. And they said, well, shoot, when you really start digging into this, your firm's name comes up here, here, and here. So there is something to be said for throwing our ideas out into the building community, like this roof idea, and getting reaction going to it. It makes us all think more. And it helps make the public understand that there's a reason why they call architecture a practice, that it's evolving. And that's good. It's like anything else. There's debate, there's research, and there's evolution.
Did you ever have a bad feeling about a client or project? And how did it turn out?
I'm dealing with one right now. Started off. There are a few basic red flags I've learned. If you say to a client couple, because if we're designing a house, we do about 50% residential, 50% commercial. If you're working with a client couple and you say, look, I'll give you an hour or two on my nickel. Come on in the office. Let's talk about your project. But you got to bring your husband with you. And if the wife just shows up or if the husband just shows up, those projects have never, ever gone well.
Good to know.
They'll say things like, well, my husband's a very busy executive. He says, this is my project. I guarantee you some point between the beginning of the design and the start of construction, the husband finally looks at the plans and says, oh, shit, no. So that's one. I think the other one is if they're really arguing a lot about clauses in your contract, you got to stop and ask yourself, what's the motivation? Like, we do have a limitation of liability clause in our contracts because we're not trying to shirk responsibility for our work, but 95% of the responsibility for the execution of our work is out of our hands and in the hands of the builder. And if we've got a client who can't understand why that's important or expects the home to be perfect because they're paying good architectural fees and they're using a good builder, and darn it, the screen door squeaks. So I've got an attorney who's going to sue everybody. And by the way, that architectural firm is right there in downtown Austin. Let's bring them into the lawsuit because the screen door squeaks. I'm not kidding you. That's what happened. So if you do get people who don't understand that stuff, that's a red flag. Then don't hire them, or don't let them hire you.
Have you had occasions where you didn't trust your intuition about somebody or a project, and how did that turn out?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And look, we've done about 700 projects, Alan and me, since we got together. We've been working in one form or another since 1982 together. So almost 40 years. And we've been sued 3 times. And in every single case, there was one of these things happening. Well, in every single case, it was a client who hired us to do a skeleton level of service. We just want a basic set of permit drawings. We don't really need you to work out the duct runs or any of this other malarkey, just the basic set of permit drawings. That's probably the largest indicator of a red flag in our firm's history.
Can you tell me about your own house? Do you still live in the house that you wrote about in Fine Homebuilding issue 157, what we described to your chagrin as the greenest house in America?
Yes. And it's been a great laboratory. It's going on 20 years this summer.
Anything you'd change about it at this point?
People ask that question a lot. I have a swimming pool that gets its heat from the air conditioner. And that's a great system because we are able to start using our swimming pool much earlier than everybody else, because as soon as we start air conditioning, instead of dumping that heat outside and being blown up, it goes to a heat exchanger and warms up the pool.
Cool.
From the perspective of somebody who swims a lot, that's great. From the perspective of a homeowner maintaining the system, absolutely not. It has been something that I've, let's call it my hobby, working out all the nuances. Now, the systems are better, but the guy I developed, who really developed it, who I let implement it on my house, is now approaching 77, 78 years old. He's not going to be around much longer. And I can read it, the writing on the wall, that when I need this stuff serviced, if it's not something simple like a compressor replacement or some electrical component, I'm screwed. But it was it's been fun for me.
How about the overall design of the house? Is it the right size? Is it the right?
No. I should have listened to myself back then too. We had 4 kids, my wife and I, and a mother-in-law that may be coming to live with us. And that dictated the design to make a 4,200 square foot house with 5 bedrooms and 3.5 baths and all that. Thank God I did that, because it was originally going to be about 5,000 square feet, and I wanted to keep it at 3,500. Well, what you don't really realize is that snapshot of the kids being all in the house and the mother-in-law being there is really a fairly small amount of years. Yeah. And there you are at 64 years old, and you're living in this 4,200 square foot house. Now, the good thing is it's zoned so that the kids' bedroom wing is entirely on its own heating and cooling system, as is the master suite from the public areas. So my energy bills are still remarkably low, but I'm paying property taxes, this is the property tax expensive state, because we don't have state income tax. So I pay $30,000 to $35,000 a year in property taxes, mostly because of the square footage. Then the other lesson I learned, by the way, is playrooms. We all used to do playrooms. Don't bother. Kids don't play ping pong or pool anymore. That transition occurred between my older 2 kids and the younger kids. This playroom, which is the size of a family room on the lower level, it almost has cobwebs forming in it. It got used so little.
Do you tell this stuff to your clients, and do they listen?
Some do. More and more what our clients are those who can relate, like their kids are in high school and they know they're going to be empty nesters. Yes. There's always if I can sound a little bit chauvinistic, there's always the wife that wants to believe that the kids are going to come back and visit them for weeks every year, and they end up wanting to have 5 bedrooms in a 5,000 square foot house. And it does take a bit of nudging to make them think otherwise.
Sure. Because you've been living it for 20 some years at a minimum, right? And it's hard to imagine a life after that, is what I'm imagining.
It is. It is. Some of the things that I did learn about the house, though, layout-wise, you're saying, is having a study near the kitchen is nice, and in such a way as mine is, with an interior window looking towards the family room, so I could see what the kids were doing on a Saturday while I was trying to catch up on my reading at my desk in my study. That part worked out well. The other thing that worked out really well was the broad overhangs. The overhangs are about 42 inches to 48 inches all around the house. I've never had to repaint the house because the paint job's wearing out. I'm only repainting the house because I want a different color scheme. And the windows almost never have to get cleaned on the outside.
I'm a huge proponent of big overhangs. I think there's few things you can do to make a house last longer and work better.
I actually have a little, if I have time.
Please.
I own 4 buildings in downtown Austin that are old houses I accumulated since I was in grad school when you could buy them for a prayer. The one that's got the 3.5-foot overhangs has required the least maintenance, and it's the oldest. It's this one that I'm in right now. Those windows behind us are the original windows. They still all work wonderfully, but there's a 4-foot overhang protecting it. The one house that's got a 1-foot overhang eats up about 60% of my annual maintenance, between potential window leaks, repaintings, you name it, it happens to that one.
Interesting. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Anything else you want to tell or ask our listeners, Peter?
Well, I'd love to get some debate going about this whole ventilated radiant barrier roof system. Just think of it as a shading umbrella that you're putting over your head in the summertime to keep you more comfortable. You do it if you're walking around India or the Virgin Islands. You do it to your house and you'll be more comfortable. But I'd love to hear others' view on that. I do want to throw out this, that I'm a little bit concerned about this non-breathable roof underlayment that's becoming popular. You know, not just the peel and seal, but also the rolls.
The synthetic stuff, yeah?
What?
The synthetic underlayments you have a worry of?
Well, if you're doing that in conjunction with spray foam, I know that you can get some breathing through open cell foam down to the attic below to dry out the decking. But I still think you're tempting fate. I think you'd be better off doing a permeable underlayment, like 30-pound felt, or at least make sure the synthetic underlayment you are specifying is permeable. Mm-hmm. I fear that we're going to, in 10 years from now, be having all these discoveries of rotten roof sheathing.
It wouldn't be the first time, right, Peter?
Nope. Of course, then we could get into the whole thing of, really, do you want to tape your house together and hope it's going to last a century? But that's a different thing.
Well, I hope we can talk about that the next time you're on the show. It's been a pleasure, Peter. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. We'll see you guys.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. Thanks to Peter Pfeiffer for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. That helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Keep craft alive, and happy building.